My name is Derek. I'm 32 years old, and I live in Denver, Colorado. I work as a sales rep, which means I'm always on the road. Long drives and hotel stays are just part of the job. I don't mind it, though. It's peaceful in a way. Or at least it used to be. This story happened a few months ago, and it still keeps me up at night. I had just wrapped up a week-long work trip in Kansas City and was driving home to Denver. It was late, around midnight, and I was exhausted. I had planned to stop and rest somewhere, but I kept telling myself I could make it home if I just pushed a little longer. Somewhere along the interstate, I missed my exit. I didn't realize it at first, but when the highway started feeling too empty, I knew something was off. My GPS wasn't working because I'd lost service, so I decided to wing it and take the next exit. Big mistake. The exit dumped me onto a narrow, pitch-black country road. The only light came from my headlights, which barely cut through the darkness. Trees lined both sides of the road, their branches arching over like claws. It felt like driving into a tunnel, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. To make things worse, my gas gauge was blinking. I had maybe 10 miles left before I'd be stranded. Just as I was starting to panic, I saw a dim light in the distance. It was a gas station. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the gravel lot. The place looked ancient, like something out of a horror movie. The single pump looked functional, but the building itself was run down. The windows were dusty, and the neon "open" sign flickered like it was on its last legs. There were no other cars, no people, and no noise except the faint hum of crickets. Still, I didn't have a choice. I parked by the pump and started filling up. The pump worked fine, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I decided to pay inside to see if anyone was around. When I walked in, the air smelled stale, like old wood and mildew. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting unsettling shadows. The store was small, with shelves of dusty snacks and expired drinks. As I approached the counter, I noticed something on the wall to my left, a bulletin board covered in missing person flyers. There were dozens of them, men, women, even kids. Most of the dates were recent, within the past year. My stomach churned as I stared at the faces. Need something? The voice made me jump. I turned toward the back of the store, where a man was partially hidden behind a door. He looked like he'd just stepped out of a nightmare. His face was pale and unshaven, and his clothes were filthy. He was holding a wrench, and I couldn't help but notice the dark red stains smeared across it. No, I was just paying for gas," I stammered, placing a $20 bill on the counter. The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me with cold, dead eyes. My heart was racing as I backed toward the door. When I got outside, I felt a wave of panic. My car was parked under the only light in the lot, and even from a distance I could see that all 4 of my tires had been slashed. I froze. The edges of my vision blurred as adrenaline kicked in. My only thought was to get out of there. I ran toward the tree line and dove into the tall grass of a nearby field. I lay there, trembling, trying to control my breathing. I could see the gas station from my hiding spot, and after a few minutes, the man stepped outside. He was holding the wrench and scanning the area. He walked around my car, then toward the field, shining a flashlight into the grass. I stayed perfectly still, praying he wouldn't find me. At one point, he was so close I could hear his heavy breathing. But then, he turned back toward the gas station and disappeared inside. I stayed hidden until sunrise. When I finally felt safe enough to leave, I flagged down a passing car and called the police. When the officers arrived, they searched the gas station and found something horrifying. In the back room, there were bloodstains and a car trunk stuffed with severed limbs. The man was gone. The police told me the station had been abandoned for years. Whoever that man was, he'd been using it as a hunting ground. I don't drive at night anymore. Every time I pass a gas station, I think of that bulletin board and the man with the wrench. I don't know how close I came to being another face on that wall, but I'll never forget the fear of knowing I almost didn't make it out alive. My name is Henry, and I'm 31 years old. I live in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I work as a regional sales manager. My job keeps me on the road a lot, traveling to different states to meet clients. I'm used to long drives and late nights, but what happened on one of those trips still haunts me. It was a Friday evening, and I was driving back to Salt Lake City from a business trip in Boise, Idaho. I was tired and just wanted to get home, but I misjudged my timing and found myself driving through a rural area after dark. My GPS lost signal, and I ended up taking a wrong turn. The road was narrow and winding, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to swallow my headlights. I kept driving, hoping I'd find my way back to the interstate. After what felt like forever, I saw a flickering neon sign in the distance. Roy's Motel. Vacancy. Relieved, I decided to stop for the night. The motel looked like it hadn't been renovated in decades. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds, and the building itself was dimly lit. I parked my car and walked into the tiny office, where a man stood behind the counter. He introduced himself as Roy. He was thin, with greasy hair and darting eyes that made me uneasy. He kept glancing at the clock on the wall, like he was waiting for something. "Room for the night?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Yeah," I said. "Just one night." He handed me a key labeled Room 6 and said, "Take this one. It's the only clean room." His words struck me as odd, but I was too tired to question it. I grabbed the key and walked to my room, which was at the far end of the building. The place smelled like mildew, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear faint creaks and groans from the rooms around me. I settled in, locking the door behind me and double-checking the windows. Exhausted, I lay down on the stiff bed and tried to fall asleep. Around midnight, I was startled awake by muffled cries and a loud thud coming from the room next door. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard it again. Crying, followed by what sounded like furniture being knocked over. I got up and pressed my ear to the wall. A woman's voice, shaky and panicked, was pleading, "Please, don't do this." Chills ran down my spine. I debated what to do. Should I call the police? Knock on the door? I decided to confront Roy first. I grabbed my phone and walked back to the office. When I told him what I heard, his face darkened. "Mind your own business," he said flatly. "What's going on in there?" I demanded. Roy leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You don't want to get involved." His tone sent a wave of fear through me. I hurried back to my room, but I couldn't ignore what I'd heard. I had to know what was happening. I crept outside and approached the window of the room next door. The blinds were slightly open, and I peered through the gap. What I saw made my stomach turn. A woman was tied to a chair, her face bruised and tear-streaked. Her wrists were bound with duct tape, and a man stood over her, yelling something I couldn't make out. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone to call 911. But before I could dial, I felt cold metal press against the back of my neck. "Drop it," a voice growled. I turned slowly and found Roy standing behind me, holding a shotgun. "You couldn't just leave it alone, could you?" he said, his voice low and menacing. My mind raced. I knew I couldn't outrun him, not with a gun pointed at me. Thinking fast, I pretended to comply, dropping my phone to the ground. As he glanced down, I grabbed a rock from the ground and swung it at him, hitting his shoulder. He stumbled back, and I took off running. I didn't stop until I reached the woods behind the motel. I hid there, crouched in the darkness, until sunrise. When I finally felt safe enough to leave, I flagged down a passing truck and asked the driver to call the police. The authorities arrived later that morning and searched the motel. What they found was horrifying. The building was abandoned. Roy was gone. But in the dirt behind the motel, they uncovered a shallow grave. The woman I'd seen was buried there. I told the police everything, but they never found Roy. To this day, I wonder how many people checked into that motel and never checked out. I haven't taken a road trip since. The memory of that night stays with me, and every time I think about it, I can still feel the cold barrel of the shotgun on my neck. My name is Max, I'm 35 years old, and I live in Phoenix, Arizona. I work as a freelance photographer, which means I'm always on the road chasing gigs. I love the freedom my job gives me, but being on the road alone can be lonely, and sometimes terrifying. This happened last year when I was driving cross-country for a project. I was heading to Dallas for a big shoot, and it was my first time taking this particular route. My GPS was acting up in the middle of nowhere, but I figured I'd just follow the highway signs. At some point, I missed an exit. I didn't even realize it until the road turned into a 2-lane stretch surrounded by nothing but fields and trees. The sun was setting, and I knew I needed to find a place to stop soon. That's when I saw a faded sign for a rest stop. It looked old, like it hadn't been updated in decades, but I didn't have many options. The next town was at least 50 miles away. When I pulled into the lot, my stomach sank. The place was eerily quiet. The parking lot was full of cars, but they all looked abandoned. Some had shattered windows, and others were covered in rust and dirt like they hadn't moved in years. Something about it felt off, but I was desperate. I needed to use the bathroom and stretch my legs. I told myself it was probably just an old rest stop that people didn't use anymore. The building itself was small, with cracked windows and peeling paint. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled like mildew and something faintly metallic, like rust, but stronger. The restrooms were at the back of the building. The lights flickered as I walked in, and the floor was covered in muddy footprints. The stalls looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years, but I didn't have much of a choice. As I washed my hands, I noticed a dark red handprint smeared on the mirror. At first I thought it was graffiti, but as I looked closer, I realized it was fresh. My stomach churned. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw her. In the mirror's reflection, a woman stood behind me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, and her throat was slit. Blood dripped down her neck as she lifted a trembling hand and pointed toward the stalls. I whipped around, but no one was there. The restroom was empty. My heart was racing and every instinct was telling me to leave, but I couldn't ignore what I'd seen. I hesitated for a moment, then approached the stall she had pointed at. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, the stench hit me like a punch to the gut. Inside, crammed into the small space, was a man's body. His face was bruised and battered, and his clothes were soaked in blood. His lifeless eyes stared back at me, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but before I could dial, I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to sneak up on me. I turned around and saw him. A man stood in the doorway holding a crowbar. His face was shadowed, but I could see enough to know he wasn't just a passerby. He was tall and broad, and his clothes were filthy, stained with what looked like blood. He didn't say a word. He just started walking toward me. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in, and I bolted past him, barely dodging a swing of the crowbar. I ran out of the building and toward my car, praying it would start. I jumped in, locked the doors, and turned the key. The engine sputtered for a moment before roaring to life. As I peeled out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man standing in the doorway watching me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, where I called the police. They searched the rest stop but didn't find the man. What they did find were more bodies buried behind the building, along with evidence linking the place to a string of unsolved murders. The killer was never caught. Even now, I can't drive past a rest stop without thinking about that night. I don't know who the woman was or how many people that man had killed, but I'll never forget the look in her eyes or the sound of those footsteps behind me.